The most dangerous sound in the world isn't a scream. It isn't a gunshot. It's the sound of a match being struck in a room that has gone completely silent. New York City, 1935. We are inside the private dressing room of the Cotton Club. The air here doesn't smell like jazz. It smells like sulfur, fear, and the cheap, distinct stench of a Robbie Burns Panatella cigar. Sitting at the vanity is a king, Duke Ellington. He's wearing a tuxedo white enough to blind you, but right now, the Duke isn't thinking about the music. He's thinking about the fact that he might die in this chair. He stares into the vanity mirror. His hands that are insured for $50,000, are trembling. A single bead of sweat, thick and oily, rolls down his temple, cutting a river through his stage makeup, but he doesn't wipe it away. He can't, because standing directly behind him is a nightmare in a pinstripe suit. Sal, the Butcher, Maranzano. A mid-level enforcer for the Dutch Schultz mob, a man who kills with the casual boredom of a factory worker punching a clock. Sal takes a drag of his cigar. The cherry burns bright orange, hot enough to singe skin. He leans over the Duke's shoulder. He doesn't just threaten him, he disrespects him. He taps the cigar and a flake of gray ash falls onto the Duke's pristine white shoulder. In 1935 Harlem, that ash is a declaration of war. Sal whispers, his voice like gravel in a blender, "You play the standards tonight, piano man. No jungle music. Or maybe you don't play at all. Ever again." Time seems to slow down. The roar of the crowd outside fades into a muffled hum. The only thing real is the heat of that cigar near Duke's ear. Duke Ellington, the man who defines American culture, is paralyzed. But then, the temperature in the room drops 10 degrees. The door behind them didn't open. It just became open. There was no click of the latch, no creak of the hinge. Standing in the doorway is a shadow, a figure carved out of midnight and granite. He wears a charcoal suit tailored so sharply it could cut you. He holds a fedora in his left hand. His right hand hangs loose, deadly still. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He doesn't look at the Duke. He looks at the ash on the jacket. Bumpy enters the room. He moves with the terrifying grace of a panther on a marble floor. Silence follows him like a cape. Sal the Butcher spins around, his hand diving for the .38 snub-nose tucked in his waistband. He is too slow. He was dead the moment he lit the cigar. He just didn't know it yet. It happens in a blur. Bumpy's right hand snaps up, snick. The straight razor catches the vanity lights, a blinding flash of silver. Before Sal can even grip his pistol, the cold steel is pressed against his carotid artery. The blade is so sharp it doesn't need to slice to draw blood. It just needs to exist. A thin crimson line blooms on the mobster's neck. Bumpy is nose to nose with the killer. Bumpy's eyes are empty. No anger, no fear. Just the cold mathematical calculation of a grandmaster removing a pawn from the board. The music from the stage starts to bleed through the walls, the low morning brass of Mood Indigo. Bumpy leans in and whispers a sentence that will become legend. "Apologize to the Duke." Most men in Harlem carried guns. Bumpy Johnson carried a philosophy. You do not touch the kings of Harlem. But this moment wasn't just a rescue. It was the match that would light the fuse on the bloodiest gang war New York had ever seen. How did a black ex-convict hold a razor to the throat of the Italian Mafia and survive? And who was the traitor watching from the shadows, waiting to sell Bumpy out? The war for Harlem is about to begin. If you respect the code of silence, hit that subscribe button right now. We are about to walk into the darkest alleys of 1935, and you don't want to miss what happens when the razor slides. Now, let's see who bleeds first. To understand why a man would pull a razor on the Mafia, you have to understand the ground he stood on. Harlem in the 1930s wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a separate planet orbiting New York City. It was a place where heaven and hell didn't just meet. They danced together on the corner of 125th Street. If you walked down 7th Avenue on a Tuesday afternoon, you would see the most violent contradictions in America. You'd see a bread line stretching for 3 blocks, filled with men in tattered wool coats, their eyes hollowed out by the Great Depression, waiting for soup that tasted like dishwater. And right next to them, rolling through the gray slush, you'd see a canary-yellow Duesenberg, shining like a diamond in a coal mine. This was the capital of Black America. The Harlem Renaissance was exploding. The music of Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway was the heartbeat of the city. But underneath the jazz and the poetry, the neighborhood was starving. The white banks wouldn't lend money uptown. The city services stopped at 110th Street. So Harlem built its own economy. They called it the policy, the numbers game. It was the poor man's stock market. For a penny, you could pick 3 numbers. If you hit, you got paid 600 to 1. In a world where a black man couldn't get a loan to buy a house, the numbers bankers were the banks. They financed the businesses, they paid for the funerals, and they sent the kids to college. It was an economy worth millions of untaxed dollars. And ruling over this kingdom was a woman who didn't fear God or the devil, Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the Queen of Numbers, a fiery immigrant from the Caribbean who spoke flawless French and cursed like a sailor. She was the one who built the empire. But she needed a sword to protect it. She found that sword in a young ex-convict named Ellsworth Johnson. But nobody called him Ellsworth. They called him Bumpy because of the knot of scar tissue on the back of his head. And by 1935, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. He was a force of nature. He wasn't your typical thug. He didn't just break bones. He quoted Nietzsche while he did it. They called him the Professor. He walked the streets of Harlem like a visiting dignitary. He wore 3-piece tweed suits, carried a cane he didn't need, and spent his afternoons at the YMCA playing chess against the best minds in the city. There is a story from the winter of '34 that explains exactly who Bumpy Johnson was. A young runner named Slick, a kid no older than 19, had skimmed $40 from the weekly take. In the mob world, stealing is a death sentence. It's automatic. You make an example. 2 of Bumpy's lieutenants dragged the kid into the basement of a pool hall on Lenox Avenue. They tied him to a chair. The kid was sobbing, begging for his mother, promising to pay it back. The lieutenants had the hammers ready. They were just waiting for the order. Bumpy walked in. He didn't look at the kid. He walked over to a table where a game of chess had been abandoned. He picked up a white knight, turning it over in his fingers. He asked the lieutenants, "Do you know why the knight is the most dangerous piece on the board?" The muscle didn't answer. They just stared. Bumpy continued, his voice soft, almost like a lullaby. "Because it jumps. It doesn't move in a straight line. It steps over the front lines. It strikes where you don't expect it." Bumpy finally turned to the kid. The room went silent. The kid held his breath, waiting for the bullet. Bumpy pulled a wad of cash from his pocket. He peeled off $200, a fortune in those days. He walked over and stuffed the money into the kid's shirt pocket. He looked the boy in the eye and said, "This isn't a gift. It's a severance package. You stole because you're hungry. Now you're not hungry. But you're also not one of mine anymore. If I ever see you in Harlem again, the hammer comes down." The kid fled, weeping with relief. The lieutenants were confused. They asked Bumpy why he let a thief go. Bumpy just put the knight back on the board and said, "Violence is a tool, not a hobby. If you kill everyone who makes a mistake, eventually you're the only one left in the room." That was the Bumpy Johnson mystique. He could be a saint on Tuesday and a devil on Wednesday. He paid rent for widows, bought turkeys for the poor on Thanksgiving, and cut throats in the alley behind the Savoy Ballroom. He was the Robin Hood of 125th Street. But Robin Hood was about to meet the sheriff of Nottingham, and the sheriff brought a machine gun, Dutch Schultz, the beer baron of the Bronx, a man so violent even the Italian Mafia thought he was insane. Prohibition had ended, and Schultz's beer money was drying up. He looked at Harlem. He saw the millions flowing through the numbers game, and he decided he didn't want to partner with the black bankers. He wanted to own them. He sent a message to Madame St. Clair. Pay tribute or pay with blood. Most of the bankers folded. They were terrified. But Bumpy Johnson looked at the message, lit a cigarette, and smiled. He told Madame St. Clair, "Let him come. The Bronx is a long way from here." The stage was set. The chess pieces were moving. And the most dangerous game in New York history was about to begin. This story is long, dark, and historically accurate. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the real history of the mob, take a second to like the video. It tells the algorithm that you want more documentary novellas like this, and let me know in the comments. If you were in Bumpy's shoes, would you have paid the tribute to Dutch Schultz, or would you have stood your ground? Now, let's meet the monsters. In the animal kingdom, there are predators who kill to eat, and there are predators who kill because they enjoy the taste of blood. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was a lion. He protected the pride. He held territory. But the man coming for him? He was a rabid dog, Arthur Flegenheimer, better known to the underworld as Dutch Schultz. If Bumpy Johnson was chess, Dutch Schultz was Russian roulette played with a fully loaded gun. By 1935, Schultz was a desperate man. The IRS was auditing his books, Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey was hunting him down, and the end of Prohibition had turned his rivers of beer money into dust. Schultz was bleeding cash. And when a man like Dutch Schultz bleeds, he looks for someone else to butcher. He looked at the map of New York City and saw a gold mine he didn't own: Harlem. The numbers game was generating millions, and it was being run by black bankers who Schultz considered inferior. His motivation wasn't just greed, it was a toxic cocktail of white supremacy and desperate ego. He couldn't stomach the idea that a woman like Madame St. Clair and a man like Bumpy Johnson were telling him no. The tension in the underworld was palpable. In the back rooms of the Embassy Club in Midtown, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of impending violence. Charles Lucky Luciano, the architect of the modern mafia, sat at the head of the table, sipping red wine with the calm demeanor of a CEO. But pacing the floor in front of him was Schultz, looking like an unmade bed, sweating through his shirt and screaming about the disrespect coming from uptown. Schultz demanded the numbers. He wanted Johnson's head on a platter. He wanted to torch 125th Street until it looked like a bonfire. Luciano, ever the pragmatist, warned him. He told Schultz he was too loud, too messy. He explained that Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a thug, he was a symbol. He warned that going into Harlem with guns blazing would start a war that the Italian mob couldn't win because the people would hide Bumpy. But Schultz didn't listen. He slammed his fist on the table, rattling the silverware, and declared that he was the syndicate. He was a relic of the past, a man who only understood force, ignoring the warning that a man who reads books and carries a razor is fatal. Schultz gave the order: break them. The war didn't start with gunshots, it started with humiliation. On a bright Tuesday morning on Lenox Avenue, a small newsstand run by an elderly man named Mr. Henderson was bustling with locals playing their daily numbers. Suddenly, a black sedan screeched to the curb. 4 men in trench coats jumped out, Schultz's men. They didn't speak. They carried baseball bats. The sound of wood crunching against glass echoed down the avenue. They smashed the windows and overturned the counter. When Mr. Henderson tried to intervene, he was backhanded with the heavy end of a bat, crumbling to the sidewalk with blood pouring from his mouth. The lead thug, Bo Weinberg, stood over him and spat on the pavement, shouting to the terrified crowd that from now on, if they played the numbers, they played with the Dutchman. The street went silent. The community watched. They were used to police brutality, but this was an invasion. Deep in the basement of the chess club, Bumpy Johnson sat in the dark. The news had reached him. Mr. Henderson was in the hospital. The message had been delivered. Opposite him sat Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the Queen of Numbers. She was dressed in furs, looking every bit the royalty she was, but her hands shook as she lit a cigarette. She told Bumpy that Schultz wanted 60% of the gross, a rate that would starve them out. She was terrified, convinced that Schultz's army would crush their operation of pocket knives and street corners. But Bumpy just stared at the chessboard. He didn't move. He told her softly that a monster is just an animal you haven't learned to trap yet. When he finally looked up, his eyes were terrifyingly calm. He told the Queen that Schultz didn't understand Harlem. You hit a man in the Bronx, he calls the cops. You hit a man in Harlem, he calls Bumpy. Bumpy stood up and put on his fedora. He wasn't going to fight Schultz on the street. He was going to fight him in the one place Schultz couldn't defend: his mind. The foreshadowing was over. The cracks in the empire were real. Schultz had made his move, driven by greed and a desperate need for cash, but he made a critical error. He treated Bumpy Johnson like a common thug. He didn't realize he was declaring war on a grandmaster. Schultz thought he was the hunter, but he was about to become the prey. The psychological warfare is about to begin. If you're still watching, type checkmate in the comments to show you're on Bumpy's side. Next up, the tension snaps. Bumpy stops playing defense and starts playing offense, but the paranoia of living with a target on your back begins to take its toll. How long can a man survive when every car backfire sounds like his death? War changes a man. It changes the chemistry of his blood. It changes the way he walks, the way he eats, and the way he sleeps. By the winter of 1935, the Cold War between Harlem and the Bronx had turned freezing, and Bumpy Johnson was no longer just a gangster. He was a ghost, haunting his own kingdom. The psychological shift was immediate and brutal. Bumpy knew he was outnumbered 10-1. The Italian mob had endless resources. They had judges in their pockets, politicians on their payroll, and hitmen imported from New Jersey like cheap labor. Bumpy had a razor, a small army of loyal soldiers, and the streets. He stopped sleeping in the same bed 2 nights in a row. He stopped entering rooms through the front door. The man known for his flashy suits and confident strut began to move through the shadows. The atmosphere in Harlem grew heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on everyone's arms stand up. Every car backfiring on Lenox Avenue sounded like a gunshot. Every stranger in a trench coat looked like a reaper. Inside his apartment, the domestic life of Bumpy Johnson dissolved into a ritual of survival. While his wife, Amy, pleaded with him to take the money and flee to Paris, to live like Josephine Baker, safe and wealthy, Bumpy sat at the kitchen table, dismantling his Colt 1911. He cleaned the weapon with the blindfolded precision of a surgeon, the smell of gun oil replacing the smell of dinner. He explained with a terrifying stoicism that there was no leaving. If he left, the neighborhood would be devoured. If he fled, the Queen of Numbers would fall, and the Duke would be silenced. He wasn't a savior, but in 1935, Harlem, the line between a savior and a gangster, had vanished completely. The paranoia was suffocating. Bumpy never sat with his back to a door. He checked his reflection in shop windows, not to admire his suit, but to see who was turning the corner behind him. He tasted his food before swallowing, expecting the bitter tang of cyanide. This was the toll of living with a target painted on your back by the most violent psychopath in New York. But Bumpy's discipline was absolute. While Dutch Schultz was screaming at his underlings and spiraling into madness, Bumpy became quieter. He became an observer. One night, at a jazz club on 135th Street, Bumpy sat in the back booth watching Duke Ellington perform. But he wasn't listening to the piano. His eyes were scanning the room, dissecting the crowd. He spotted them instantly. 2 men in fedoras at the bar. They weren't clapping. They weren't drinking. They were watching the stage with the dead-eyed focus of sharks. Bumpy didn't panic. He didn't flip the table. He simply caught the eye of his lieutenant across the room and gave a single imperceptible nod. His men moved through the crowded club like smoke, flanking the intruders before they could even reach for their coats. There was no scene, no screaming. The 2 hitmen were simply escorted out the back door into the rainy alley, and they were never seen in Harlem again. Bumpy Johnson was winning the psychological war because he refused to let them see him bleed. He remained the calm in the center of the storm. But he knew that the storm was getting closer. He knew that eventually luck runs out. He knew that the only way to kill a king is to find a Judas, and the Judas was already in the car. This story is long, dark, and we are just entering the deepest part of the night. It is 3 a.m. in the city that never sleeps. What time is it where you are watching this from? Let me know in the comments. Are you a night owl like Bumpy, watching the shadows, or are you watching this in the safety of the daylight? The betrayal is coming, and it's coming from the passenger seat. In the underworld, the bullet that kills you is rarely fired by a stranger. It's usually fired by someone who knows your mother's name. While Bumpy Johnson was fortifying Harlem, the rot was already spreading from the inside. It began in the back office of a corrupt police precinct in East Harlem. Captain O'Malley, a man whose pension was funded almost entirely by the mob, sat behind a desk piled high with paperwork, counting a stack of cash thick enough to choke a horse. Standing across from him was Sal the butcher, the same man Bumpy had humiliated in the dressing room. They weren't planning a raid. They were planning an execution. The Dutchman had grown tired of the stalemate. He didn't want a war anymore. He wanted a funeral. Sal explained that they didn't need the police to pull the trigger. They just needed them to look the other way for 10 minutes on 122nd Street. But to get Bumpy Johnson into the kill box, they needed bait. They needed someone Bumpy trusted. They needed a traitor. That traitor was driving the car. It was Slick, the same kid Bumpy had spared over the chess game, the same kid whose life Bumpy had saved with a $200 severance package. But gratitude has a short shelf life in the slums. Dutch Schultz's men had found Slick, terrified and broke, and offered him a choice. Set up your old boss, or we visit your mother. Slick chose survival, the atmosphere. Inside, the 1932 Cadillac was suffocating. Slick gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror every 3 seconds. In the back seat, Bumpy sat in silence, reading the evening edition of the Amsterdam News. But Bumpy wasn't reading. He was listening. He listened to the engine revving too high. He listened to the shallow, erratic breathing of the driver. He noticed that they weren't taking the usual route to the safe house. Bumpy lowered the paper. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply observed the sweat dripping down the back of Slick's neck and realized with a sinking heart that the boy had sold his soul. Then, the trap snapped shut. Suddenly, the interior of the car was flooded with blinding white light. A black sedan screeched around the corner, blocking the road ahead. Another car roared up from behind, boxing them in. It was a classic pincer movement, a military tactic adapted for the concrete jungle. The silence of the night was shattered by the terrifying mechanical racking of Thompson submachine guns, the Chicago typewriter. Bumpy didn't ask questions. He didn't freeze. His instinct for survival was faster than conscious thought. Before the car had even come to a full stop, Bumpy kicked the rear door open. He didn't dive for cover inside the vehicle. That was a coffin. He rolled out onto the wet pavement, the asphalt tearing through his suit, just as the night erupted in fire. Hundreds of rounds shredded the chassis of the Cadillac. The windows exploded into diamonds. The metal groaned and twisted under the hail of lead. The gunmen, standing by their vehicles, poured fire into the back seat, convinced they were turning the King of Harlem into Swiss cheese. But when the shooting stopped and the smoke from the gun barrels drifted into the rainy air, the back seat was empty. Bumpy was gone. He had used the steam rising from a sewer grate as a smokescreen. He had moved into the darkness, circling around the attackers. He was no longer the target. He was the knight on the chessboard. He had jumped the line. The gunmen reloaded, confused, peering into the ruined car. They didn't see the shadow detaching itself from the wall behind them. They didn't hear the footsteps. Bumpy Johnson stepped out of the dark. He wasn't holding a gun. In his right hand, the silver straight razor caught the moonlight. He had brought a blade to a gunfight, and for the first time in history, the gunfight was about to lose. He was behind them, and the streets were about to run red. They brought machine guns to kill a chess player, but they forgot that the most dangerous piece on the board is the one you don't see coming. Bumpy Johnson survived the ambush. But what he did next, what he did to the men who tried to kill him, and the punishment he reserved for the traitor Slick, would become the darkest legend in Harlem's history. This was just the opening move. The real war starts now. You want to see how the king takes his revenge? Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You do not want to miss what comes next. The rain in Harlem washes away a lot of sins, but it doesn't wash away blood. On that street corner, under the flickering hum of a broken streetlight, the hunters had become the hunted. The 4 gunmen standing by the riddled Cadillac were reloading. They were confident. They were laughing. They thought they were looking at a hearse. They didn't realize they were standing in a graveyard. Bumpy Johnson moved through the steam rising from the sewer grate like a phantom. He didn't run. He glided. In the criminal underworld, there's a difference between a fighter and a killer. A fighter wants to win. A killer wants to end it. Bumpy wasn't looking for a fight. He reached the first gunman from behind. The man never hurt him. He never felt the hand clamp over his mouth. He only felt the sudden, icy burn of the razor. It was quick, clinical. There was no scream, just the sound of a heavy coat hitting the wet pavement, a sound like a wet sandbag being dropped. The second gunman turned at the noise. His eyes went wide. He raised his Thompson, but the barrel was too long for close quarters. Bumpy stepped inside the guard, grabbing the hot barrel with his bare left hand, ignoring the searing pain of the heated metal, and driving the razor forward with his right. It was over in 6 seconds. 2 men down. The other 2 panicked. They fired blindly into the dark, shattering windows 3 stories up, but the target was already gone, circling back into the shadows. Fear is a heavy coat, and now they were wearing it. They dropped their weapons and ran. They ran all the way back to the Bronx, carrying a story that would terrify the entire underworld. You can shoot at Bumpy Johnson, but you can't hit a ghost. Silence returned to the street. The only sound was the hissing of the steam and the weeping of the traitor. Slick was still in the driver's seat of the ruined Cadillac. He was curled into a ball, shaking so violently the car vibrated. He had heard the bodies hit the floor. He knew what was coming. The passenger door, riddled with bullet holes, creaked open. Bumpy didn't yell. He didn't drag Slick out by the collar. He simply sat down on the edge of the running board, calmly, as if he were waiting for a bus. He took out a handkerchief and wiped the rain and grease from his razor. He spoke to the air, his voice low and weary. "I gave you a night, Slick. I gave you a way to jump over the front lines, and you used it to drive me into a wall." Slick sobbed. "They made me, Bumpy. They said they'd kill my ma." Bumpy sighed. It was a sound of profound disappointment. "They were going to kill her anyway, son. Once you do the devil's work, he doesn't pay you. He just closes the account." Bumpy stood up. He looked at the boy he had tried to save. In that moment, the professor was gone. The chess player was gone. Only the gangster remained. "Get out of Harlem, Slick. Run. Run until your legs give out. If the sun comes up and you're still on this island, the debt gets paid in full." Slick scrambled out of the car, slipping on the wet asphalt, and sprinted into the dark. He left his dignity, his home, and his soul on that corner. Bumpy didn't leave the scene immediately. He walked over to one of the fallen hitmen. He reached into the man's coat pocket and pulled out a distinct, cheap cigar. A Rob T. Burns Panatella, the Dutchman's brand. Bumpy lit it. He took a drag, watching the smoke curl up into the rain. He wasn't hiding anymore. He walked to the nearest call box on the corner. He didn't call the police. He called the Embassy Club. When the bartender answered, Bumpy left a message for Dutch Schultz that was shorter than a telegram, but heavier than lead. "Tell the Dutchman I missed him tonight. Tell him I'm sending his boys back. And tell him the price of the numbers just went up." The sun rose over a changed city. The war was no longer a Cold War. The streets were open trenches. Bumpy Johnson had survived the assassination attempt that was supposed to end him, and in doing so, he had become something more than a man. He had become a myth. And Dutch Schultz, safe in his fortress in the Bronx, felt a chill go down his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. He realized he hadn't just missed a target. He had unleashed a wolf. Bumpy showed mercy to the traitor, but no mercy to the hitmen. Was letting Slick go a mistake that would come back to haunt him? Or was it the last shred of his humanity? Let me know your verdict in the comments below. Mercy or mistake? A wounded animal is dangerous, but a wounded ego is lethal. The news of the failed assassination didn't just reach the Bronx, it hit the streets like a bomb. Bumpy Johnson hadn't just survived, he had sent a message written in blood. For Dutch Schultz, this wasn't just a business failure, it was a cosmic insult. Inside his headquarters at the Palace Chop House in Newark, Schultz was unraveling. The man who had once ruled the beer baronage of New York was now pacing the floorboards until they creaked under the weight of his paranoia. His empire was crumbling. The IRS was seizing his assets. Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey was tightening the noose around his neck, and now a black gangster from Harlem was openly mocking him. Schultz made a fatal calculation. He decided that the problem wasn't Bumpy Johnson. He decided the problem was the law itself. He called a meeting of the 5 families. He demanded an audience with the commission. The meeting took place in a private suite at a midtown hotel, far removed from the blood and grit of the street. The air here smelled of mahogany, imported silk, and the quiet confidence of men who owned the city. At the head of the table sat Lucky Luciano. To his right, the financial genius Meyer Lansky. These were men who treated crime like a corporation. They didn't like noise, and Dutch Schultz was nothing but noise. Schultz stood before them, his eyes wild, his voice cracking. He didn't ask for help with Bumpy Johnson. He asked for permission to kill Thomas Dewey, the special prosecutor. The room went silent. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped. To kill a prosecutor was to invite the full weight of the United States government down on their heads. It was suicide. Luciano looked at Schultz with the cold detachment of a mortician measuring a corpse. He said no. Schultz slammed his fist on the table. He screamed that he would do it anyway. He stormed out of the room, declaring that he didn't need their permission. As the door slammed shut, Luciano turned to Lansky. He didn't speak. He just raised an eyebrow. The decision had been made. The rabid dog had to be put down. But to do it, they needed to secure Harlem first. They needed to know that the war uptown would end the moment Schultz hit the floor. The most important meeting of the war didn't happen in a boardroom or a back alley. It happened on a park bench in Central Park, under the cover of a gray, overcast afternoon. Two men sat side by side feeding the pigeons. One was Lucky Luciano, the other was Bumpy Johnson. It was a meeting of two worlds, the Italian mob and the Harlem underworld. In any other decade, they would have been shooting at each other. But today, they shared a common problem. Luciano spoke first. He didn't use racial slurs. He didn't threaten. He spoke to Bumpy as an equal. He acknowledged that Schultz was bad for business, for everyone. He told Bumpy that the commission was going to retire the Dutchman. Bumpy listened, his eyes on the birds fighting over a crust of bread. He knew this was a turning point. If he agreed, he would be partnering with the very organization that had tried to enslave his neighborhood. But if he refused, the war would drag on and more people in Harlem would die. Bumpy made his terms clear. If Schultz goes, the Italian mob stays out of the numbers. Harlem stays independent. The tribute ends. Luciano nodded. He respected strength. He respected a man who could hold a razor to a throat and a conversation with a king. They shook hands. It wasn't a friendship. It was a ceasefire bought with the promise of a dead man. The deal was sealed. The fate of Dutch Schultz was signed on a park bench, sandwiched between the autumn leaves and the cold wind. Bumpy Johnson went back to Harlem, not as a subordinate, but as a recognized power. He had forced the Mafia Commission to come to him, but knowing a man is going to die and waiting for it to happen are two different things. Schultz was still alive. He was still dangerous, and like a cornered beast, he was about to lash out one last time before the darkness took him. Bumpy just made a deal with the devil to kill a demon. Was trusting Lucky Luciano a stroke of genius, or was Bumpy inviting a bigger shark into the tank? Hit the like button if you think Bumpy made the right call. The finale is approaching, and the history books are about to be written in blood. When a war ends, the silence is always louder than the gunfire. In the months following Dutch Schultz's death, a strange calm settled over Harlem. The winter of 1935 turned into the spring of 1936, and for the first time in years, the snow on Lenox Avenue wasn't stained red. The Italian families, true to the word of Lucky Luciano, stayed below 110th Street. The policy banks reopened. The jazz clubs played until dawn without fear of a shakedown. Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the queen who had refused to bow, began to step back into the shadows. She had fought the law, the mob, and the Depression, and she had won. But she knew that the era of the independent operator was ending. The game was changing. It was becoming colder, more corporate. She looked at Bumpy Johnson and saw the future, a future where the sword was more important than the scepter. She gradually handed the reins of the empire to the man who had saved it. Bumpy Johnson was now undisputed. He wasn't just a gangster anymore. He was a one-man institution. If you lost your rent money, you went to Bumpy. If your son was in trouble with the police, you went to Bumpy. He walked the streets not like a predator, but like a mayor who had been elected by the bullet rather than the ballot. But heavy is the head that wears the fedora. The victory over Dutch Schultz had cost Bumpy something irretrievable. The professor, who loved chess and philosophy, was slowly being consumed by the Godfather, who had to order broken legs and midnight disappearances. He spent more time alone. He would sit on the benches of St. Nicholas Park, watching the city breathe, always with one eye on the horizon. He knew that in the underworld there is no happily ever after. There is only until next time. He knew that new wolves were being born every day, younger, hungrier, and more vicious than the Dutchman ever was. He knew that eventually the law would come for him harder than the mob ever could. The chess match wasn't over. The opponent had just changed from a gangster with a gun to a judge with a gavel. Alcatraz was waiting in the mist of the future. The heroin epidemic was waiting to rot the neighborhood from the inside out. Malcolm X was waiting to challenge his soul. But for now, in the twilight of the 1930s, Bumpy Johnson stood tall. He had drawn a line in the sand against the most powerful criminal organization in American history, and they had been the ones to blink. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling up toward the stars that hung over Harlem. He had protected the Queen. He had saved the Duke. He had kept the neighborhood yours, mine, and ours. The legend was written. The Black Pope had ascended the throne. And as the streetlights flickered on, one by one, down the length of 125th Street, the city whispered the name that would echo for the next 30 years. Bumpy. History is a long road. Bumpy's journey is far from over. From the cold cells of Alcatraz to the fire of the civil rights movement, the man who defeated the mob is about to face the one thing he can't outsmart: time. Victory has a price, and in the underworld, the bill always comes due. Bumpy Johnson had defeated the Dutch. He had secured the crown. But the government of the United States does not like kings who don't pay taxes, and they certainly don't like black men who wield more power than senators. The 1940s brought a new enemy, an enemy that couldn't be bribed, intimidated, or cut with a razor: the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. They didn't want a truce, they wanted a trophy. While Harlem celebrated its godfather, the chess pieces were being moved in Washington, D.C. The charge wasn't murder. They could never prove that. It was conspiracy. A word that allows the law to lock a man up for what he might have done, rather than what they saw him do. In 1952, the gavel finally came down. 15 years. The destination wasn't a local jail in upstate New York. It was a rock in the middle of the freezing San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz. Imagine the king of Harlem, stripped of his tailored suits, stripped of his diamond rings, and stripped of his name. In Alcatraz, he was just number 1117. But even in hell, a king is a king. The story of Bumpy Johnson doesn't end with a prison sentence. It transforms, because it was inside those damp concrete walls that the professor met the student. A young, red-headed thief named Malcolm Little. The world would come to know him as Malcolm X. While the Italian mob thought Bumpy was finished, rotting away on the rock, he was actually sharpening his mind. He was reading history. He was planning his return. And he was watching from afar as his beloved Harlem began to change. The jazz was fading. The heroin was rising. The streets he had protected were being flooded with a poison that killed the soul before it killed the body. The Bumpy Johnson who entered Alcatraz was a gangster. The man who would walk out was a revolution waiting to happen. They thought they had locked him away to be forgotten. They didn't realize they were just giving him time to think. And a thinking Bumpy Johnson is the most dangerous thing on earth. The razor is put away, but the mind is sharper than ever. If you are ready to follow Bumpy into the belly of the beast, if you want to know what really happened between him and Malcolm X, click that subscribe button right now. The Rock is waiting, and so is the truth.